So now that we've talked about the way we think about risk and return for individual assets, we need to go a couple steps farther and talk about how we think about risk and return when we have a collection of individual assets. Okay? Because holding a collection of assets allows us to change our overall exposure to risk and return. And this can be a really useful and extremely valuable tool. In fact, it's going to be sort of the foundation for modern investing and the way that we ultimately end up thinking about how risk and return trade off. Okay? So a collection of assets is called a portfolio, and a portfolio is also itself an asset. Right? So a portfolio is an asset that contains a bunch of other assets. And a portfolio could be any number of assets. It doesn't have to be just a collection of financial assets. A portfolio can be a collection of any asset. And remember, anything can be an asset, right? Every single thing is an asset, and the distinguishing characteristic between any asset and a financial asset is that a financial asset generates cash flows. So our portfolio could be a collection of houses, could be a collection of rental houses, it could be one house, one car, 40 shares of Apple, 3 bonds from Ford, and a loan that you made to your little brother, right? That is a portfolio of different assets, financial and non-financial, right? Now, of course, what we're really going to talk about in this class is the portfolio of financial assets, so a collection of stocks or a collection of bonds. But remember that the terminology here is much broader than that. So you might hear someone talk about a real estate portfolio or an investment portfolio, and that could contain any number of different assets. Okay? So a portfolio's risk and return are dependent entirely on the assets that are inside of the portfolio and those assets' risk and return. And this is important because the reason we form a portfolio is to try to find a collection of assets that will help us reduce our risk without reducing our return very much. Right? And we can do this by intelligently forming a portfolio. Right? So I'm saying intelligently very specifically because we can slam any number of assets into a portfolio. I can collect 50 different internet stocks, Apple, Google, Match.com, all into one portfolio. That doesn't mean that it's magically going to make my portfolio better. Actually, that's not quite true. It does do a little better, but I can do much better by really thinking about the assets that we collect and how they interact with each other. And when I do that, I can form a portfolio that might drastically reduce my expected risk without drastically reducing my expected return. Now, the fundamental rule of finance here still holds that risk and return trade off. So if I reduce risk, I am going to reduce return. There's no way around it. But because of a unique nature of portfolios and the way that assets can interact, I can reduce a certain kind of risk and actually eliminate that risk altogether. And then I don't reduce return by as much. Okay? So we got to form a portfolio, and to form a portfolio, we need to talk about how to calculate what are called portfolio weights, which are the percentage of each asset within my portfolio. So how much of my portfolio is made up of Apple stock? 30%, 20%? That's what a portfolio weight is. Okay, so you can see the example that we're going to work on portfolio weights here. And the solutions are also in the slides. Now that we've talked about portfolio weights, we can talk about the way that we calculate the expected return of a portfolio. And there's 2 ways to calculate the portfolio expected return. The first way is to treat the portfolio as a collection of assets. And if we do it that way, we say that the expected return of the portfolio is the weighted average of the portfolio of the asset expected returns, right? So that's why I calculate the weights. I look at all the weights that are inside the portfolio, and then I look at the expected return for those assets, and I take the weighted average of those expected returns. Now, the second way I calculate the expected return for the portfolio is to treat the portfolio itself as an asset and ignore all the individual assets inside of it. Well, not ignore, but treat it as an asset itself. And so then I can calculate the portfolio expected return as the probability weighted outcome, just like I do with any other asset. And I'll show you an example of both ways here. And then we need to talk about the portfolio variance. And the portfolio variance can only be calculated in one way, which is exactly the same as I calculate the asset variance for any individual asset. In other words, I can use this weighted average trick to calculate the expected return. I cannot use a similar method to calculate the portfolio variance. The portfolio variance is not simply the weighted average variance. And this is because the way that portfolios work is they work in reducing risk in a systematic way. And so because of that, it's not just an average of the risks. It's a unique characteristic into of itself. So we need to be really careful here when we calculate portfolio variance that we don't just fall into a rut and do it as a weighted average. It's not a weighted average. Okay, so we'll finish this part by working a few examples of portfolio expected return and variance, and we'll look at how they work together. And that's the end of this first part of chapter 13, where we just talk about asset expected returns and variance and portfolios. In the next part, we'll jump into what the mechanism is that allows us to reduce risk by forming a portfolio and why that works. And then use that all to tie into how risk and return actually trade off in the market and how we value assets.